Welcome back to the Now What podcast. I'm your host, Arian Foster. I want to give a special shout out to Smarty Pants Vitamins. They're the title host of this, the sponsor of this podcast. So go out and get them stuff. Get you some of them. So hey, I have a special guest in the building today, man. This one's gonna be fun for me, man. We got Alex Alonso, and for people that don't know who Alex Alonso, I've read your credentials. I've tried to re-say them. Could you please list your credentials, man, so I don't butcher them?
Well, I graduated from the University of Southern California, which is probably the greatest university on God's green earth.
I hear you.
I got my bachelor's degree there in the 90s. I went on to work in geographic information systems there for a couple of years, and then I went back to grad school. I got a master's in urban geography in the late 90s, early 2000s. I think it was 99 or 2000. And then I entered a doctoral program in geography. And since I started, the geography department has shut down, so I transferred over into the sociology department, and I'm currently ABD, all but dissertation status, on a PhD in sociology.
Man, congratulations, bro.
Thanks.
Congratulations. And also you got producer credits as well, man.
I've produced quite a few documentaries for, History Channel, HBO, MTV, BET, TV One. All kind of programs for mostly, a lot of network stuff. I've done some local Los Angeles stuff. I've published. I got peer-reviewed articles published, a bunch of online articles published. Started a website like 20 years ago.
Right.
And I teach at Cal State Long Beach.
Man, see, and what do you teach there now?
I teach actually a class called Street Gangs in the Chicano and Latino Studies department.
Perfect. All right. So see, that's what drew me to you, and the reason why I invited you to come have this conversation with me in the first place, man, was because I was subscribed to your YouTube channel, unbeknownst. I didn't know it was yours, but for years it's called streetgangs.com, and I caught wind of it early on, but I wasn't really into the internet when I was growing up. But streetgangs.com, for people that don't know, it's kind of like a documentary style overture or oversee of urban culture, specifically gang culture. Mm-hmm. It's the best I could do.
Yeah. I look at it as getting geography, history, a little bit of sociology, current news events on gang culture with an emphasis on Los Angeles, but I cover other cities, other jurisdictions as well.
Right.
But it started at my college. It started at USC one day when we were asked to create a website, and everyone in the classroom was like, "What's a website?" Because this is the mid 90s.
Yeah.
I actually created it in 95. So when you went on the internet in 95, there was not a lot of stuff online. So no one knew what a website was. So,
that was those dial-up days.
Yeah, it was dial-up. Actually, it was dial-up, and the web browser was called Mosaic. For those who go back to 95, yeah. There was no Netscape, Internet Explorer, and that's how it started. It was on the university server. It stayed on the server for about 3 years until they told me you're getting too much traffic on this website.
Wow. And
then I bought the domain name streetgangs.com in 1998 and moved all the files. And it's just been growing ever since. Yeah,
it's really interesting, man. It's crazy that it started like that. It was just like it was a project, I guess, and you was like, start a website, and then it turns into this big thing. It's like a worldwide thing, really. You did it in an interesting time in the mid 90s, and the mid 90s was really, I think, is probably the height of gang activity in Los Angeles. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say from 1987 to about 1995, that was the really high years of violence. Homicide rate was through the roof. Right. Los Angeles was averaging 1,000 murders a year, and now we're at like 280. So, right. And our population has grown by 1 million people.
Right. So it's even better proportionately.
Yeah. The murder rate is extremely low. 280 people is a lot of people.
Right, for sure.
We don't want to undermine the families of those 280 people, 100%. But from 87 to like 95, we were averaging high 900s and over 1,000 during those years. So yeah, it was a hot period.
Right. So what drew your interest into kind of documenting the gang culture in LA? Because you're from New York originally, correct?
Yes, I was born in the Bronx, and my family's from the streets. My dad and my dad's brothers, even my mom's side, everybody's from the streets. And my family is immigrants, so they were immigrants, came to the Bronx. All of my family is Puerto Rican, My mom's side actually immigrated. My dad's family immigrated, but he was born in the Bronx, and they just had a street-oriented lifestyle. And I grew up in that, witnessing that. My dad's, my uncles, on both sides were pretty much what you would call gang members today, but they didn't use that terminology. They called them clubs or street organizations. And when I moved to LA, I saw a similar type of street culture, but completely different. Another street culture, but Bloods and Crips, which didn't exist in New York when I was there.
Right.
That came much later.
Right.
So I got to LA and I saw these guys doing their thing, and I just always been fascinated with the street life. And growing up in New York, you always heard about the mafia. There's 5 crime families in New York, and they're always on the news. And I would watch the news and be like, wow, these guys are crazy. And I always wanted to know what moved these people. Right. Like, how come these people were doing what they were doing? And so it's always been in me, but I didn't start researching it academically until I got to USC. But I always tell people I think I started researching it when I was 12 years old.
Right. No, for sure. I mean, we're all products of our environment, and we take it in, especially as a kid. And so that spurred your interest. I always have too. Like, secretly, I've always been interested in that lifestyle. It's appealing, man, because when you're young, you don't really know much about the world. You're trying to figure it out, and you see these there's a lot of camaraderie in gang culture that people don't see from the outside. All you see is the activity and the crimes. But like, there's a lot of camaraderie. There's a lot of family oriented sensibility about it that always drew me in, and also I think specifically the West Coast gang culture is specifically interesting. And it always interested me because it was almost like this like secret society, and they had everybody had a clique, and they had their code names, and they had their terminology, they had their handshakes, they had their territories, and it always interested me. Is that what kind of pulled you into the specific LA West Coast?
I think I would have been interested in gang culture wherever I was living. It just so happened I landed in Los Angeles. I went from New York, which is pretty much one of the biggest parts of the United States, to Los Angeles, which is the second largest part of the United States. And what I thought was interesting about it is, when you're a kid, you don't ever want to be victimized. So in order to stand up to people who are dominant within the school setting or in the community, you need friends. And sometimes those friends come in the package of gangs. And when you're 12, 13, 14, the gang life isn't that serious. It's not as the way the media and law enforcement portrays gang activity. Most of the gang activity that you see on the news headlines are adults, late 20s, early 30s, even 40s. But when you're 12, 13, 14 years old in the 7th, 8th, 9th grade in junior high / middle school, it's more innocent. It's just about, I don't want to get victimized, and I want to hang out with people that have common interests as I do, and we all live in the same area. So there's usually a racial or ethnic commonality and a residential or geographic commonality, right, especially for Black and Latinos. Right. And that's kind of like the very beginnings of most kids' gang career. Right.
I mean, so can you dive into a little bit as far as like it's the academic aspect of it, as far as like how gangs started, like specifically the West Coast branch of it, I guess you could say.
Well, I was always fascinated with the African American gang culture, being the Bloods and Crips. So when I was working on my master's thesis, I really wanted to find out, like, how did these gangs actually start? There's got to be a starting point to the Bloods and Crips. They didn't always exist. So I started to read up the very little research that existed on what was going on in Los Angeles when the Crips and Bloods started. And then I happened to have another friend that was doing the same research, but he was doing it in the form of a documentary. A guy named Cleabone Sloan. So Cleabone Sloan and I kind of hooked up in the 90s. I was writing my master's thesis. He was formulating his documentary, and then we kind of exchanged information. And what we found was that the 1960s in Los Angeles, the civil rights period, was pretty instrumental in the early stages of the Crips and Bloods. The Crips started first. And before the Crips and Bloods, there was another generation of black gangs that existed during the post-World War II period. And most of all those gangs eventually came together in 1965. If you're a historian of Los Angeles, everyone knows what happened in 65. It was the largest riot in American history. So a lot of those groups kind of came together, and we're talking about Slawsons, businessmen, gladiators, the Roman 20s, there's just so many of them, at least 20 or 30 black gangs. And LA went on a different course in terms of the black community. It was now about the Black Panthers, US organization, fighting for civil rights, challenging police brutality. And that lasted from, say, 65 to the late 60s. But the government got involved in fighting with the Black Panther Party and fighting with the civil rights period. And a lot of these dudes end up going to prison or they end up killed. The Black Panthers had a huge shootout on 41st and Central with the LAPD. It's the first time that SWAT was ever used. SWAT was invented by the LAPD.
Oh, wow.
And I believe that was the first time that SWAT was deployed. It was the shootout with the Black Panther Party on 41st and Central. You know, Geronimo Pratt was a big part of the Panther Party,
right.
A veteran of the Marines that came back to help his community, taught his people about self-defense, weapons, and eventually all of that came to a crash. And you have a bunch of kids now that are about 14, 15 years old, are like, what's the name of your podcast?
Now What Podcast?
Now what? Now these kids are like, now what? What do we do?
Wow.
And Raymond Washington is credited as starting the first Crip gang, and eventually, you know, it just snowballed from the East Side Crips to the West Side Crips, and then an anti-Crip force was formed. Right. They eventually became the Bloods, and that's sort of what happened in the 1970s.
Man, that is... It's just heavy hearing that from somebody, from a historian's perspective, because you hear all the folklore about it, right? How much of I'll ask you questions. How much of this is folklore? So like, where did Tookie Williams fit into the picture? Because he's a huge influencer of the Crips as well, correct?
Yeah, he lived on the West Side. Raymond lived on the East Side. So the first Crips started on the East Side. In fact, all of the activities within the African-American community really start on the East Side. So the Black Panthers, they had their office on the East Side. All of the early Panther members were from the East Side. And then the West Side got involved. So Raymond starts the East Side Crips. He lived on a street called 76 near Wadsworth, which is the heart of the East Side. And then eventually he wants to spread this brand throughout L.A., and he goes to the West Side, and he goes to where St. Andrews Park is at, which is right off of Manchester near Western. That's the West Side. Mm-hmm. And that's where Tookie and his circle of guys come into play. And you have to also mention a guy named Donald Archie, because Donald Archie actually brought Tookie to the neighborhood. We often talk about Tookie because he's the one that ended up on death row. He wrote the children's books. Right. He was nominated for a Peace Prize. But there's a lot of other West Siders that were just as instrumental as Tookie was. They're just not as known. Right. So then Raymond comes to the West Side and tells these guys, you're going to become West Side Crips. They have a meeting at a movie theater on Western. And then 1971, all the cats on the West Side, including Tookie, decide we're going to be West Side Crips. The East Side Crips were already established around late 69, 1970. And then in 71, you got the West Side now becoming Crips.
So who was the founder of the anti-Crip movement, which ended up becoming the Bloods?
That's a very difficult question to answer, because during this period when Raymond started the East Side Crips and was instrumental in the West Side Crips, there were a lot of other neighborhoods starting at the same time that were not Crips. So around the same time, you got some dudes in Compton starting the Pyrus. You have T. Rogers over in the West Adams area starting the Black P Stones. The Denver Lanes are starting at this time. And then these names are all gangs that become Bloods. But at the time, they were just independent street groups. Street names. So you had also, just mentioned the Denver Lanes. You had the Pyrus. Oh, and then you had the Brims. So all around 1970, there's about 5 or 6 other gangs that are not Crips. And eventually Raymond went to all those neighborhoods to try to convert them into Crips.
What was his, from your studies, what do you think his incentive was? What was his mission statement? Like, what was his goal for recruitment? Like, what was he trying to do in recruitment?
I think that's also a difficult question to answer. I've heard so many stories on what his purpose was, what his goals were. initially, I think it was all about protection and not wanting to be a victim.
Mm-hmm.
But then eventually he wanted to spread this brand, and in doing so, he met resistance. Sometimes dudes would say, oh yeah, we'll become Crips and without a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But then there were guys like the Athens Park Boys. They said, no, we don't want to be Crips. So Raymond had a way of trying to force people to become Crips because he was a amazing fighter from what I understand.
And back then it was mostly about hands, correct?
It was all about hands in 1970, 71. Even 72, even though in 72 gunplay comes in a little bit, but it was all about hands. And he would fight whoever the leader was in that neighborhood. Pretty much had, after the age of about 17, I think Raymond Washington is undefeated as a fighter.
Oh, wow.
I heard that he did lose a couple when he was like 15, 14, but people say, that don't really count when you're that young.
Right.
But once he got about 17, 18, there's not a story where he loses a fight. And he fought everyone. And so some of these neighborhoods converted, but the Brims said, nope, we're going to stay Brims. The Pyrus eventually decided they didn't want to be Crips. And all of these other neighborhoods, the Black P. Stones under T. Rogers immediately rejected the Crip brand. So at some point in the mid to late 70s, all these what's called anti-Crip neighborhoods, they come together, they coalesce, and this blood identity is born around 78, 79.
When did they start adapting flags and colors?
Well, the Crips started using the color blue in 1974 when a guy named Buddha, who was an OG West Side Crip from Tookie's crew, he was killed. And Buddha wore a blue rag for some reason. He was the only dude that had a blue bandana. And when they went to his funeral, everyone came with a blue bandana to memorialize Buddha. And since that day, the Crips wore blue.
Wow.
After Buddha's death in 74. And there's so many stories of how the Bloods eventually wore red, but I think they just decided to take the oppositional color.
Right.
Around 78, 79, they took on the color of red. How it came about, I don't think anyone can answer that question of who decided, which neighborhood was the first. But I would say the Pyrus were very early involved in this blood movement. So were the Pueblos that were also on the east side in Pueblo del Rio housing project. And the Brims, the Pueblos, and the Pyrus were very early in the anti-Crip movement.
Man, that's it. It's so interesting hearing it from academia, because you hear the folklore growing up, you hear all the stories, but hearing actually from somebody who studied and heard mouth to mouth from all of these people, it's interesting, man. When do you think the movement changed, and why, from a protection agency to a criminal organization, to where we're trying to control the territory for whether it be drug trafficking or whatever the case may be?
I think that change happened very quickly. I think that within probably the first year or two, meaning that would be the very early 70s, it turned into something more violent and more confrontational than the early members ever expected it to be. And even in the 70s, the level of violence that these guys were involved in is way surpassed by the time you get to the 80s.
Right.
So a lot of these guys that are already getting old in the 80s are looking at what's going on, and they're like, wow, this is what we never intended. Yeah, we didn't do this. We didn't mean for this to happen. But to your point you just mentioned, when I was young, I never even thought that this type of topic was worthy of academic research.
Right.
And when I got to USC, when I was a junior in 93, someone had told me there was a professor teaching a gang class, and they knew I was really interested in gang studies. And I didn't believe it. And I started to go through the catalog because I had already had my classes for my major. And I looked, and it was Dr. Malcolm Klein teaching a class on street gangs. And then there was another professor, James Diego Vigil, teaching a class out of the anthropology department. And that's when I realized that this is a topic worthy of academic study. And I went to those professors immediately, and eventually they became my mentors and guided me along the way. But for a long time, this was while I was in high school And fresh out of high school, I never thought that this would be something that you can study on this level because I didn't know there was an interest in it. I thought I was the only one interested in it.
Right. No, I mean it's a part. I mean it's not a beautiful part, but it's a part of American history, and the way you detail it when you're talking about the first time SWAT was used. Now SWAT is a household name, but that was used directly in the conflict with the beginnings of these organizations, man. So when you're detailing like American history, like this is why this isn't so impressive to me, because it's like black market history almost, you know, and it's like the Civil War. You're talking about thousands of people that have died over these things, and this is why I think it's important that the work that you're doing and you've done throughout your career.
Well, now I'm at the point where I feel like all of these guys' names, like Raymond Washington, Stanley Tooker Williams, Donald Archie, Sylvester Scott, all these guys to me are important to study and important to know historically, whether or not you like what they did or whether you're against what they participated in. It did lay a foundation of what's going on in LA. It has big public policy implications when it comes to laws and legislation and law enforcement and the way resources are allocated. And it's just an incredible story, I feel, that needs to be told. I'm more interested in these guys than I am about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe.
It's more relevant. It's way more relevant. Like you said, these moves that these guys have made has directly, like you said, affected policy, affected the transference of resources throughout the neighborhoods. It's a huge deal. And I mean, what was your Did you come across any kind of friction in trying to get this information out, or even recovering some of this information?
Yeah, in the 90s, I would always ask people, I want to meet some OG Crips. I want to meet some OG Bloods, and people didn't know who I was. They thought I might have been the police.
Right.
I was a cop. Who is this dude? And then just the more I did it, and then the more I got out there, just people started to know who I was. And I kind of started where I grew up in L.A., which was an area that had gangs. And once I started in my neighborhood, I was able to talk to the people that I grew up with that knew me directly and then point me into other directions, to other people's name. It took a while, but I'm at the point now where it's very easy.
You got a pass.
Yeah, I guess you could say I got a pass. There's a couple of guys I've been trying to talk to about the history that are a little resistant, because now some of these guys want to be paid for their stories. Right. They want to write books. They want movies. And, it's kind of difficult to assist all these people in these endeavors. Right, but I used to have a lot of challenges in the early days, but now it's become a little bit easier.
Right. I mean, I can only imagine, man. I mean, did you have any kind of reservations at first, like going into some of these neighborhoods you weren't necessarily familiar with?
Nah, I just I'm a little fearless in that area.
Yeah.
I pretty much go anywhere, go places where I'm told not to go. And even when I travel out of town,
better than me, man.
When I travel out of town for business or a conference or lecturing, the first thing I do is get my rental car and I drive to the ghetto. Take some pictures of the graffiti, jump out and go to the projects, and just work on being able to relate to people, not only just in Los Angeles, but anywhere I go. And people remember that. So I can go back to Fort Worth, Texas. I can go to New Orleans. I can go to Pork and Beans in Miami. I've been to all these places. I've pulled out cameras and asked questions. And where I'm at in terms of recognition, they hit me up and welcome me all the time. Right. I get invited to cities that I haven't been to yet. Alex, when you come into our city, we got the welcome mat waiting for you.
That's awesome.
So that's why whenever I travel, I visit people that live in these underserved communities first. Then I go take care of my business.
Man, it's beautiful. I mean, like, what's the biggest? Because obviously you have a certain amount of respect from these neighborhoods and from these communities. What do you think the biggest misconception is from an outsider looking in, from a drug and gang-ridden community?
The biggest misconception is the level of violence that these people are actually responsible for. When you think of gangs, you pretty much think of, the way that the gangs are portrayed, I'd say, in the media, is that they are like a very predatory group of kids. It's often pathologized. Everyone gets painted with the same brush. But when you hang out in a gang, let's say I take you to a gang of 100 guys, of these 100 guys, probably about 10 or 15 of them are very aggressive, and the other 80 or so are just your average run-of-the-mill kids. So, and the level of violence and the level of participation is different for every single person. Not everyone is pulling a gun out and shooting. Not everyone is selling drugs. Not even everyone knows how to sell drugs. Selling drugs is a business.
Right.
And as we all know, not everyone's business-minded. You can't give an ounce of cocaine to just every gang member and think he's going to flip that and then flip it and flip it again.
Right.
So that's the biggest misconception, is that every gang member is involved in drug trafficking and that every gang member is ultra-violent.
Well, I mean, what do you think the remedy for, I guess, rebranding that is? Because a lot of kids are in prison that shouldn't be in prison.
Yeah, that's true. But the two reasons why we think that gangs are as violent as they are is, one, the media. Right. If you ever watch the first 11 minutes of the 11 o'clock news, it's all violence.
Yeah.
So that right there plays with our psyche. And then the second part is that when the media reports crime, they're receiving their pressers from law enforcement. And law enforcement deliberately wants to project that narrative that they're all violent and that they're all involved in nefarious activities, because they have a job to prosecute. So it's a very difficult narrative to challenge, because how huge is law enforcement and how huge is the media? They work together. So I can tell you, if you really want to learn about gangs, read David Brotherton's 2015 book. But how many people are really going to read this academic book that's 200 pages long that is telling you the truth from cover to cover about gangs? Only my students are going to read that book, you know. I would love for all the people that come to my channel, the hundreds of thousands of followers and the millions of views I get, to read a book like that. But the reality is they're not. Right. They're going to be influenced by the local news, and they're going to be influenced by law enforcement narratives.
My God. I've never thought about that aspect of it, actually, about how, I mean, the media, the bias the media portrays, and that law enforcement is in bed with the media, and the media directly controls the narrative of the people, and how much that narrative influences behavioral patterns in our society to kind of keep the cycle going of that fear.
It actually influences legislation too. And I would say the media is in bed with law enforcement. The media is in total control. They're controlled by the law enforcement when it comes to crime reporting. So if, like all our gang laws in California, which I don't agree with probably 90% of the gang laws, but they were all fed by the fear card. Our legislators in Sacramento were influenced by the fear that the media projects to the general population, and then that drives the legislation, the anti-gang legislation. And we just received a ruling. A judge ruled that gang injunctions, which were popular, actually they were invented in Los Angeles. Here we are. They were ruled unconstitutional in 2017 after they've been used for like 30 years. You know, I've always been against them. I've never thought they were effective. I've always knew that
So what exactly are gang injunctions?
Gang injunctions are basically lawsuits, or restraining orders is a good way to put it. Let's say you're in a domestic violence relationship with a boyfriend or girlfriend. They could put a restraining order. Everyone knows about that. Mm-hmm. I can file a restraining order against my boyfriend, meaning he can't do X, Y, and Z. He can't come around me, whatever is in that restraining order. They can do the same thing for street gangs. It's a restraining order against a street gang, and then what they'll do is they'll list activities that they are prohibited to engage in. So they can't hang out with each other. It's called the association clause. They cannot be maybe with a cell phone. They can't be with tools. They can't do a bunch of things. And if you are caught doing any of these things within what's called a safety zone, they also have to map out the area where all these restrictions now become illegal. Then you can go to jail. And the first injunction was back in 87. So that's 30 years ago. Right. And they challenged them back in 87. And for whatever reason, some judge said they're constitutional, even though everyone knew they weren't. Here we are.
What court did they say that? It wasn't the Supreme Court.
The California Supreme Court decided it, narrow vote in 1997. I think it was 5-4 or 4-3 in favor of gang injunctions with a few modifications. So they got rid of you cannot prohibit someone having a cell phone. You can't prohibit someone from using a beeper. Beepers were big back then. Right. And they actually listed those in injunctions. So the California Supreme Court said, we're going to we're going to allow the injunctions to go through, but we're going to make some slight modifications. So here, that was 97, and here we are in 2007. Well, 2017, which was a few months ago, they just pretty much deemed them illegal.
Oh my God.
So now they're not being enforced in Los Angeles.
Are they doing any kind of retracting?
I'm not sure what the next steps are, but I know that there were some lawsuits that were filed by some civil rights attorneys. I know that the ACLU had filed some lawsuits against either Los Angeles County or Los Angeles City. And I remember saying maybe 10 years ago that one day these injunctions are going to be obsolete. But what people don't know, the injunctions were part of the gentrification plan for Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And that's why they started them in the 1980s, because in order to develop in a particular neighborhood, you got to suppress the gang. Or to get developers comfortable with coming to an area that is, low income, high crime, you have to have control of the gang. City says, okay, we'll control the gang so that we can get developers to build. That's how the Staples Center got built here in Los Angeles. They had an injunction against all the gangs on the west side of the Staples Center like 3 years before the Staples Center was built.
My God.
So we knew the Staples Center was going to get built. So what they did was, let's have an injunction against all these gangs, because we don't want anything to happen to the people that come to watch the Lakers or the Clippers. So they think the gang is the problem, and they have an injunction against the gang and do all this development. So that's all part of the gentrification process.
What does an injunction look like? How does one know it has an injunction against it?
You get physically served by a police officer. So a city attorney drafts up the injunction. It says City of Los Angeles versus gang, whatever gang it is.
Right.
And then,
they do entire gangs.
Yeah, they do the entire gang.
Oh my God.
So let's say a very popular injunction was against the Venice Shoreline Crips. So City of Los Angeles versus Venice Shoreline Crips.
Wow.
And then they'll list all the Venice Shoreline Crip names, and then they'll put 1 through 500 John Does for those that they don't know the names of. So any future Venice Shoreline Crips that aren't known today are still going to be subjected to this injunction. So what they have to do is serve you.
That's insane.
They have to physically serve you. So then they give the injunction to the police that are patrolling the neighborhood, and then when they see someone, they hop out on them and say, boom, you've been served. You've been served.
And
so
it counts for the whole neighborhood.
Well, it counts for the individual.
Okay.
So they have to serve every individual.
Okay,
Yeah.
I thought they were just for the whole block.
I've had guys tell me that they were in prison when the injunction went into effect, and they got served in their cell.
Oh, wow.
So a warden would come here, you just been served, the city of LA suing you. So that's how you're under an injunction. And then you have the right to challenge it like any sort of civil case, but gang members never challenge it.
You don't know how to...
And that was part of the reason why they overturned them in 2017, because they didn't give gang members a fair way to challenge them in court, because they just didn't have the know-how, and then by default, they became permanent.
So what is your opinion on this? Because this is... it's a huge... The political climate in today's society is really rough, right? And I think it's a lot of this. It's because of this. It's because you have a group of people who feel like they're being oppressed, and a group of people saying there is no oppression, although those days are over with. But then I hear things like this, and like it's subtle oppression. It's subtle ways to try to keep people in this cycle of poverty and this cycle of irreverence, and it's disheartening when I hear things like this. Do you see it as a part of that system?
Yeah, absolutely. I see it as a very racist instrument used to control black and brown bodies in the city of LA, and used to control bodies that aren't necessarily violating the law. Right. Another interesting thing is you can be served in a gang injunction and have no criminal record ever. So it's not just against people who we think are violent, but it's anyone who we think associates with this group or organization. So I was just hurt and devastated when kids were coming up to me saying, I've never been in trouble, Alex. I've never been to jail. I have no record, but the police served me. And that's devastating when you're like 15 or 16 years old, and now you have to worry about this injunction will create your criminal record.
Oh, 100%.
And it has for many people.
Right.
And I've been to court many times on behalf of these gang members. I testified in court on behalf of gang members to say, hey, this is inappropriate, trying to convince juries that Look, I know you've been influenced by the news and the media, but I'm here to give you another side of what it's like to grow up in these communities. And every once in a while, we score a victory.
Right.
But it's difficult in these courts.
Yeah. I mean, you're fighting. This is the mountain I think that we are up against is like you're fighting generations worth of bias, generations worth of women in the elevator holding a purse when somebody gets in, right? So you're fighting these inherent biases that have been programmed into people. And how would you, like, that's like kind of alluding to the question I already asked, like how do you remedy the rebranding of our neighborhoods?
Well, one thing that I try to do is when I'm in court, I tell jurors, I want you to forget everything that you've ever been told about a street gang or a gang member or gangs in LA. Let's start fresh. And don't judge that guy that's sitting there at the table because he's got tattoos on his face. You won't believe how easy it is to just convict a black kid in court. He has a tattoo on his face. He's a gang member. The jury goes to sleep and say he's already guilty without hearing the evidence. So what I try to do is reteach them about how these kids end up in gangs, the communities where gangs form, and the conditions of the family dysfunction, the school dysfunction, and the community dysfunction of which all these kids are born out of. And some of the choices, yes, they made a choice, but they made a choice among very limited choices at their disposal. And to give them the benefit of the doubt of some mistakes they have made, and look at this person as a human being and forget about everything, all your biases and assumptions that you've had. And it works in certain courts. I could tell you in a downtown LA court, there's going to be some success because LA is diverse and you might get a diverse jury. But in other parts of LA County, if you're in the Antelope Valley, that jury is 50 and over and all white. If you're in the Torrance court or the airport court, you're looking at the South Bay community of LA County, and we're talking about middle class, all white. The best
jury of my peers.
Yeah, the best juries, unfortunately, are downtown LA and Compton. A Compton court, you will have and that's really a testament to our justice system because it takes our own people, which is Compton, the Compton court and the downtown LA court, to look at these cases without the same biases that we're talking about. And it happens more consistently in those two courts. But any other court, you can forget about it. Those biases that you talk about, they're not shaking those biases.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate, man. It's the world we live in. So I think part of the frustration is trying to get kids to understand their role in it. And I guess it's like you don't want to victim shame, right? But like a lot of choices that they make are the choices that they've had available, right? And they're young and you make mistakes. Like what are some of the things that you see as solutions to problems in our communities?
Well, there's two main problems. You could intervene when there are kids that are already involved, which is kind of difficult. Or you can try to prevent. You know, the big two words in LA when it comes to doing this gang work is prevention and intervention. So prevention starts really young. So you have to really be in the elementary schools. We're talking about second grade, third grade, and fourth grade. Right. I believe that there should be gang education in the local elementary schools every other grade, meaning first grade, third grade, fifth grade. And teaching the kids the consequences of some of these choices that they're going to make in middle school.
That's brilliant.
But they don't have the resources to support something like that. So the third leg of that, of intervention prevention, is suppression. Suppression just means we're going to send all of our law enforcement resources into a community and just arrest everyone and throw them all in jail. So those are the three approaches: intervention, prevention, and suppression. And guess where most of the money is going towards right now of those three? Suppression.
All day.
Now here's the irony of it. Law enforcement will always admit intervention and prevention is very important. They talk a great game, but when it comes to, well, how much money are you going to spend on that? They're spending all their money on suppression. So it's sort of like a hypocritical position that they take. They say how important it is, but they don't invest in it at all. But that's what it's going to take, is education at the elementary school level, because a lot of these kids come from families that have so much abuse, whether it's mental, physical, or sexual abuse, which we don't talk about in black and brown communities, the sexual abuse that not only against girls, but young boys. And many of our future gang members that are going to be on the streets were sexually abused at a young age that they never want to talk about. So those are the things we got to talk about. We have to have an open conversation, and we have to divert resources towards the intervention and prevention arm of this gang work.
What all brilliant points, man. I wish I could clap after everything you say, but what is the big difference you see in the gangs today in juxtaposition with the gangs that when you first started doing this research?
Well, I would say that the gang culture is pretty much the same as it's always been. The changes that you might see in the gang will be the same changes that we see in society. So the gang isn't on some different trajectory out here in outer space doing their own thing. As the internet and as social media has become popular in our society, so have gang members started to use it. So everything in your life and my life that has changed over the years, the changes in gang members' lives. We've seen overall crime drop in Los Angeles from, I say, in the last 15 years. And that's the same with gangs, because the city of LA collects they have two sets of crime data. They have gang crime data and non-gang crime data. And if you look at both the sets, you'll see declines in both the non-gang and gang data. So that means that gang violence is pretty much a natural phenomenon when you look at the total violence of the community, of a city, of a state, or a country. So I think that there's fashion changes. There's more people involved in music. Now, as you know, man, everyone's rapping. You too. Yeah. Everyone's got a mixtape. Gang members are like, hey, let me jump on this. So we have more gang members involved in music. And some of these dudes got skills and talent. We see fashion changes. Everyone thinks that gang members wearing skinny jeans is corny, but skinny jeans are hot now. I see Nipsey Hussle wearing skinny jeans.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
I can't wear. My shape isn't even designed for skinny jeans. But
I mean, that's what's funny though about skinny jeans is like you see some big guys wearing skinny jeans.
I've seen that.
Like, bro, come on, man. You gotta skip this wave.
I think Nipsey has the perfect shape for skinny jeans. He's tall and thin.
Yeah, I was joking. That's my guy.
But I don't get all bent out of shape when I see gang members wearing skinny jeans because everything's evolving. I'm sure in the 80s when gang members were wearing Pendletons and khakis, the gang members from the 70s were like, we were wearing suits and Ace Deuce hats. Everyone has a critique of the next generation. So, I mean, there's all kind of things have changed, but one of the biggest changes that I'm really proud is that the crime rate is way lower.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what's funny is like you don't hear the media reports about that. That's not being blasted all over the television.
You know what's crazy is the media reports about the same amount of crime as they did 15, 20 years ago.
Is there any studies on that?
Yes, there are. There's a lot of studies. In fact, there are studies on the way the media reports gang crime as well. A couple of authors looked at the three major magazine news weeklies, U.S. News and World Report, I forget all the three names, but they looked at 10 years of them telling gang stories and found that they emphasized on crime, they emphasized on the fear card, and they emphasized on the exaggerations of gang culture and gang crime, meaning that if you want to learn about gangs, you do not want to go to your news weekly magazines, and also the newspapers have been studied how they tell stories on gangs. And I believe it's like 95% of gang stories in the LA Times are about crime. Jeez. They're not about intervention. They're not about success stories. They're not about OGs who have went back to their neighborhood and made a difference. They're not about athletes coming back to the community. It's all crime. And then at the end of the day, it's because newspapers, magazines, and even now the internet, it's a business.
Yeah,
you want clicks? You want to sell magazines?
See, that's the huge problem, and see why I feel like, and I'm not even, I don't have any journalistic background, right? But I even me entering this game, in this podcast game, right? I felt like I had a responsibility to not do clickbait. It's about giving good, honest conversations with people who I think we can have important dialogue, right? So anytime entertainment and information is intertwined, entertainment is gonna swallow that every single time, and that's what's happening. And just like you said, if the crime rate is down, why are we reporting on crime as much?
Yeah, I think our news story should have less crime in it.
That's dangerous as hell, man.
I have a friend that studies poverty, and he told me that every time they do a story about poverty, they show black faces, even though the largest group that's in poverty in America are elderly whites.
Really?
Yeah, elderly whites are the number one group living at poverty or below poverty. But any magazine or any story about poverty, they show black faces.
Is this disproportionately, or just like, did they?
I believe that it is by rate as well. Okay. So, I mean, there's a lot of white people in America. It's over 60%. Right. For those, when we live in LA or we live in big cities, we don't see how white America really is.
Right.
You go into middle America, you go into all those red states that are in the center of the U.S., it gets very white. But if you're in big cities, you don't see how white it is. I believe America's like 65% white.
Right, it's majority.
And most of the poverty is white. And if you look at the elderly population, I believe, according to some of this research, elderly whites are poorer than elderly blacks. But what's the image of poverty in America is black faces. Mm-hmm. It's you're not going to see white faces on a poster about poverty. And it's the same thing with gangs. Everything you learn about gangs in terms of the crime rate. Here's a big misleading representation of gangs. They always show gangs in movies, television shows using fully automatic weapons, AK-47s, Uzis. 96% of all gang homicides are done with a handgun, usually like a .38 or a .380. But when a movie does a story about gangs, they got them holding fully automatic weapons, which are rarely ever used in a real gang conflict in L.A. So it kind of, when you're watching these stories and you're watching these movies, even the movies are influencing our ideas and our thoughts of the way gang members are and how they act. I can tell you that they rarely use AK-47s in shootings.
No, I mean, the branding of gangs has always, I mean, it's obvious because like if you grow up in any kind of neighborhood with any kind of gangs or any kind of issues like that, you see how people live and how it's portrayed and personified, and it's night and day difference, man. I wanted to dive into as well your studies now, which is the brown part of your study. So like my mother is Mexican, right? So I'm half Mexican. So I've always interested in this side as well. What is the differences? Oh, so I just start. What have you learned from the differences between the Mexican Latino? I'm never sure what term to use. Mexican Latino side of LA versus the black. Because there is some conflict, some areas, and some not, right?
That's correct. Well, in the 80s, when I was a kid, the blacks were the dominant gangs in the streets of L.A. They controlled the dope, they controlled the money, and they controlled the neighborhoods because most neighborhoods were majority black, except for East L.A. and Boyle Heights, which are two communities that are right next to each other. That's predominantly Latino. And they've always had the control over there in terms of the gang world. But then over the years, we have more and more Latinos migrating into South LA, into other parts of Los Angeles where they didn't traditionally live. And now we have this mixture now of black gangs and Latino gangs in the late 80s, early 90s living together, which went okay for a while. And then eventually when Latinos became the majority, like people don't realize Compton is majority Latino now. Watts is majority Latino. The east side of LA, which was all black in the 50s, 60s, and 70s and 80s, is majority Latino now. So these are the areas that are where we're starting to see conflict now between blacks and Latino gangs. And a lot of the black gangs are becoming smaller and smaller because there's been an out-migration. A lot of blacks have been leaving L.A. since the 90s, moving to the Inland Empire, which is to the east, and they've been moving north to the Antelope Valley. So when a black family moves out, it's usually replaced with a Latino family. So that's what's changing the demographics of these areas, and it has had an impact on the gang scene too.
So I mean, what kind of impact? What are the heavy ridden gangs in Latino gangs in LA right now?
Well, one area where I think the impact has been most significant would be on the east side in an area called Florence, which is an area that was majority black in the 60s and 70s. Latinos started moving in there. And now Latinos are the majority. And I would say around in 1999, 2000, the gang there called Florencia 13 went to war with the East Coast Crips, which was as a gang that's been there since 1970. And that's been going on now 18 years, and it's probably the most violent conflict between a black and a brown gang in Los Angeles.
Is it because I've always thought the blacks and Mexicans had kind of a conflict, just from my where I grew up, and then I moved to San Diego, and there was kind of a conflict there. But there's a lot of places where there's an understanding. Is it more or less one or the other, or is it kind of just?
I think there's more peace in between black and Mexicans in Los Angeles, and places like Florence and on the east side are exceptions to the rule. On the west side of LA, there's not too much black-brown conflict, but I'm not sure if that's related to the lack of numbers for the Latino population. There may be, I'm looking at this, and I believe there might be a theory is when the Latino population becomes the dominant, that's when the relations change. When blacks are the dominant, they don't necessarily have an issue with the Latinos. And it's not the Latino population themselves. It's not the Mexicans themselves. What people don't realize is that prison politics has a huge impact on the Mexican gangs in Los Angeles. Black gangs aren't controlled from prison. No one controls black gangs. They control themselves. They're not under any politics, any rules. But all the Mexican Chicano gangs in Los Angeles fall under the prison politics. So if people in prison tell these gangs, you have to do X, Y, and Z, they're going to do it.
So what explain the dynamics of prison politics a little bit.
Well, in California prisons, there's 4 major prison gangs. You have the Mexican Mafia, which is a Southern California-based prison gang. You have Nuestra Familia, which is a Northern California prison gang. Then you have the Arian Brotherhood, which are white supremacists. And then you have the Black Guerrilla Family, which is the black prison gang. Now, the Black Guerrilla Family, which is the most powerful black prison gang in the CDC, California Department of Corrections, they don't control Bloods and Crips on the streets. But the Mexican Mafia controls all the Sureño gangs or the Latino gangs in Los Angeles. So that's where all the politics comes into play from the Latino side.
So when somebody goes into prison, you have to pick a side.
Racially?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like if you went to jail, even though you have Mexican blood in you, you can roll with the Mexicans, but then you cannot roll with the blacks at all, or you could pick the blacks, So you definitely, especially if you're on a level 4 prison. Now, California has, depending on the severity of your crime, you go to a level that matches that severity or the number of points you've accumulated as an inmate. If you get over 60 points, you go to level 4, or if your crime is serious, you go straight to a level 4 prison, which is the most severe. And level 1 is the most relaxed. If you're the politics come into play really on the level 3 and level 4 yards. If you're level 1, you might not have to worry about, oh, this guy's black or this guy's Mexican or this guy's white. But if you're on a level 4 yard and you're black or you're Mexican, you're going to stay with your own.
Right. I mean, how did that start?
Man, that started in, the 1957 is when the Mexican Mafia started their thing. They're the first ones to really decide we need to come together. And what's amazing about their history is that these guys that started the Mexican Mafia in prison, they were like 14, 15 years old.
Jeez.
They were minors that were sent to Tracy Prison or DVI, Dual Vocational Institution, and they had a juvenile yard where they would send serious juvenile offenders. And in 1957, I think about 10 of these Mexican juveniles decided, we're tired of getting bullied. We're tired of these men think they could punk us. So they started in 1957 in Tracy, California. And from the very first year, they started stabbings just to let everyone know we're for real. So leave us alone. And then eventually they got their respect.
Man, there's like an underlying theme here. Like I see is like when you look at the historicity of gangs and the historicity of Mexican mafia or Black Guerrilla Family or the Crips or the Bloods, it all starts from a place of we're tired of this shit. So like, how do we reverse this cycle? How do we? I mean, I know you touched on some of the points already, but it's like a collective effort that I see, and I think it's possible, man. Because when you step back and I'm listening to you talking, this is somebody like I said, man, the work you've done has been brilliant, bro, and I appreciate it. But when you look back and I mean when you step back and you see all of this violence, all of these things that have gone on under the guise of false bravado that was birthed from a survival tactic. Kids just wanted to survive and wanted to be treated like equal people.
Yeah.
Like, how do we start enforcing that into people? Like, they just want to be regular people. These kids aren't, like you said, animals. Like, if you look at the divisiveness of our president right now. Like, he's calling all the Mexican gang member or MS-13, they're all animals. These are animals. It's like when you start driving that narrative to people, this is what you do when the media gets involved and all these people, and then you have this whirlwind of like us versus them, rather than these are just some of our hurt brothers and sisters.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things that I don't think we're never going to get rid of gangs. We have to embrace this reality because in American society, gangs have been in the streets of our urban areas since 1840, since we've had urban areas, and we've been trying to get rid of gangs for over 100 years. It's never worked. So the solution is let's redirect the energy of gangs. And it's similar to what they did in 1965 in Los Angeles. All those gangs that were fighting each other, they became political. It was similar to what Jeff Fort was trying to do in Chicago with the Vice Lords and the Gangster Disciples. They went political. Unfortunately, they incarcerated him, and they just completely had an impact on the goals he was trying to achieve there. But even in New York City, the Latin Kings, very popular Puerto Rican gang, led by Antonio Fernandez, he decided to change the direction. Let's go political. And there's a lot of research and writing that this can be a successful way to divert this negative energy, this we don't want to be victims anymore, and turn it into something more political, something that could work towards social change. Because the Black Panther Party in Los Angeles and in Oakland were really guys that were from the streets. You know, they were basically gang members, right, but they were able to create something and divert it into something different. I think the same could happen with Crips, Bloods, Sureños, MS-13. It just takes a little bit of work, a lot of bit of resources, some education, some training, and we can see gang members out there helping people vote or helping people get tested for HIV or just doing anything that's socially productive in the community. Because these guys don't really want to go to prison. Because whenever a gang member gets arrested for a case and he's looking at forever, they call me up. I need help. That means you don't really want to be there. Right. Let's try to find something else better to do. And unfortunately, law enforcement is not on board with that because gang members, like you said, the president is calling MS-13 members animals. Law enforcement is they don't believe that gangs can do anything positive. But the research tells us they can.
So do you think that it's a strategic infrastructure that is keeping the cycle of gang culture prevalent in our community?
I do think that there are certain groups that have an interest in gangs and gang crime. Look at our prisons. We have 33 or 34 prisons in California. Those prisons need to be filled. You got to put bodies in them. Also, just about every city has gang units, gang cops, gang officers, gang investigations. Imagine if we didn't need that anymore. There are people's careers based on having gang crime. You know, there are people who rely on the Crips and Bloods so that they can pay their mortgage and raise their family. So there's an absolute interest in keeping this going, you know.
Wow.
We have politicians that all they do is write laws against gangs. That's how they're getting their $200,000 a year. So you would be ignorant to think that we could create a movement and try to reduce the gang issue and have everyone on board. You're not going to have law enforcement on board. You're not going to have the prison industry on board. You're not going to have politicians on board, no matter how many lectures and how many speeches and how many press conferences that they say they are on board, because their careers are pretty much based on this still existing.
Like when you frame it like that, it's some of the most psychotic thinking. Like people are dying, and like God.
You should hear the stories that gang members tell me when they interact with gang officers, because it is a very disrespectful interaction that officers have with the youth. And it is not even a job or a career where you can look at it as an outsider and say, great job, you know,
right.
Keep it up. It's almost like I don't believe we even need gang officers. We don't need gang detectives. We don't need all of this gang enforcement. And then even the federal government plays a large role in financing and funding these investigations. Mm-hmm. So every year in LA, there's like 3 indictments against a gang. And these are the indictments that used to be designed for John Gotti and the Gambino crime family, or Paul Castellano, or all these big guys that have like 30 murders under their belts. They're using the same RICO laws to prosecute guys that are selling 5 grams of cocaine on the corner of their poor neighborhood. So it's almost bizarre to see the same laws. In fact, the people that wrote the RICO laws in the 70s, they said that it was never intended to go against neighborhood youth. But that's what they're doing now. So the feds will collaborate with LAPD or the sheriff, do a 1-year investigation, announce at a press conference, we arrested 100 gang members, tell you that they're all demons. And then if you read the indictment, you're like, Tyrone was arrested for 10 grams of cocaine and he's going to prison for 10 years. And you read every single person's charge sheet, 15 grams of heroin, 20 grams of weed. And it's like, wow, is this what we're doing with our money?
It's infuriating. Like listening to this. I mean, I've heard this. My sister does a lot of work with activism. My father's been hippie, man. He's from Carson. He grew up in Carson. So I've heard about all this for years, man. But just the more you dig into it, the more infuriating it is, because it's purposeful. It's
deliberate.
Yeah, it's deliberate, and it's just demeaning.
You know what hurts me is when I'm in court, and this is the goal of a prosecutor. The prosecutor wants to know, what are the maximum charges that I can give this gang member? Let's say he shot a gun into a building. He's got possession of a weapon, shooting a gun into an inhabited dwelling, attempted murder on one person that was standing there. And after you read all the charges, that sounds kind of redundant. It's like he did one thing, right, but you charged him 4 times. And then they add what's called the gang enhancement, which we haven't even talked about at all. But the gang enhancement now can double each offense. So if the possession of a gun is carrying 5 years, you add the gang allegation to it. Now that's 10. The shooting into an inhabited dwelling might be another 5 plus 5. The attempted murder will be 15, and then add the gang enhancement, that'll be another 15. Before you know it, this guy's looking at like 60, 70 years. No one was hurt. No one was killed. No one was hurt. No one was shot. And the prosecutors, they do this because that's the culture of a DA's office. The culture of a DA's office is, how many charges did you hit him with? I got him with 6. And then when they go to their cocktail parties, they brag about, I just got this guy 70 years. Well, I just sent someone away for 110. I got you. And that is the culture of it. I bet this is the culture across America. I'm only speaking for what I know here in Los Angeles County. But speaking to attorneys in other places, that is the culture of our district attorney's office. It is to put black and brown bodies, to overcharge them, charge them as much as you can, and max them out as much as you can.
Man. And not only that, when you look at like how the state appointed attorneys, like things like that. How like you have no shot in winning your case because you don't have the resources for lawyers, and those lawyers are in bed with the DA, and it's just this like it's a cycle. It's a cycle, and like you said, it's deliberate. God, I just went blank because that's just infuriating. Like I'm getting angry just hearing this. Like it's shit I know, but it's like you hear it in this detailed, like plotted out, like and it's cyclical.
See, I got an interface with the district attorney's office and their prosecutors every week. So, I read stacks of discovery almost every other day. So this is this part of the work I do. I'm just so used to it.
How do you cool off? Because I'm heated right now.
well, the way, you see, when I first started consulting on legal cases, I used to really look at whether or not the guy was guilty, and then I realized after like 3 or 4 trials, this has nothing to do with his innocence or guilt. This has to do who puts on the best show for the jury, who can present the best case. So now when I look at a case, I'm just like gun-ho on it. Like, how could I present a oppositional narrative from the district attorney? Because all they want to do is send this guy to prison for 100 years. And in most instances, that is just way too much time. Yeah. And they don't think of it that way. They're populating. That's why a lot of older people are getting out of prison now. A lot of people in their 70s a lot of people who had life sentences in the 80s are getting out now. People who were never supposed to get out, they're getting out now because the culture of our DA, especially in LA, is to send all these 18, 19, and 20-year-olds to prison for like 80 years. And it's populating our prison system, and to build prisons is expensive. But yeah, I try to do my best to present a counter narrative to the DA's version. And oftentimes my counter narrative is the truth. It's the honest version of it. And you'd be surprised too. This is what really gets my blood boiling, is when police come to court and testify. They pretty much borderline perjure themselves. Well, now the definition of perjury, that's up for debate, but I would say that they exaggerate and bend the truth in all kind of ways just for the sake of a guilty verdict.
It's almost like they have quotas. It's like they have quotas. They have to meet these quotas, and
they do. And if they lose, here's the thing: if they lose a case, they get in trouble.
By who?
By their bosses, the DA. Like if a prosecutor loses the case, like, wow, you lost this case, they're not going to get the promotions that they wanted. They're not going to be able. See, every prosecutor, just like, what's every college football player's dream?
NFL.
Every prosecutor's dream is to become a judge. There's levels to this. So in order to become a judge, you got to win. You got to prosecute. You got to have a flawless record, no blemishes. And if you lost a couple, they hold that against you, in terms of getting promotion. So that's what makes the culture of a DA's office just so insensitive, because it's all about winning and maxing people out.
I was just hearing this. It's like...
And we all know that every college football player is not going to the NFL.
Yeah, of course.
I remember at SC, I think 3 or 4 dudes out of what is 55 people on a roster?
53.
53. About 3 or 4 might make it.
Right.
Every DA, every prosecutor is not going to become a judge,
right.
But they all think they can. They all want to be, and they will do whatever it takes to get that promotion.
So it's just like, it's not even about truth. It's never about truth.
It hasn't been about truth. I've been doing this work for over 15 years, and I think I learned in like the 2nd or 3rd year. Actually, one time I was working on a post-conviction case. The dude was already convicted of murder. He had already served 4 years in prison, and this accounting firm was taking on his case, his appeals. They gave me the box of discovery, 2 boxes. About 10 minutes into the first box, I already figured out he was innocent. I figured out who the shooter was, and I wrote a declaration on his behalf. Eventually, we got him out. He did 10 years. Got him out. But I was shocked at how quick I was able to find the trigger person in this discovery, and how quick I was able to figure out this guy had nothing to do with it. And I didn't get to see his trial, but I was just shocked, like, wow, he was convicted? This dude was convicted by a jury for murder, and he got out in 2006 after doing 10 years, completely innocent, had nothing to do with the shooting. But the prosecutors, they don't care.
How many people would you say? I mean, a ballpark percentage that are in prison that are innocent?
Ooh, that's pretty hard. I worked on. I got 4 people out of prison that were innocent. That's just me. 4 cases. I've worked on. I don't know. I would say. Whew, I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah, it's rough to put you on the spot.
It is hard. It is hard. It's definitely more than 1%.
Right.
It's probably. I don't know. 10% is a lot, but I wouldn't be shocked if 10% of our inmate population is innocent.
Right.
You know. And here's another thing: a lot of innocent people take plea deals.
Yeah.
Because they're looking at 100 years. On paper, they're looking at 100. And they will give you that 100 if you take it to trial. Mm-hmm. But when they tell you, here's an 8-year deal, what are you going to do? You're going to risk getting 100, or you're going to take that 8-year deal? Most guys take the 8-year deal because they don't want to risk being in there for.
They don't have good enough attorneys.
Yeah, well, I even think with good attorneys, I've seen private counsel advise their defendants take the deal.
Really?
Yes, because you don't know what a jury is going to determine. Right. You don't know what they're thinking. You don't know what the outcome is. You don't know how they're going to deliberate. And most of the time, the juries are going to believe police officers in uniforms and prosecutors because their thing is, well, why is this black dude at this table anyways? Right. He must be guilty. So even private attorneys know they're taking a risk. But yeah, you need money. You need money in this system.
But it's just like you set up to fail, man. Like at every angle, like because it's like it's a cycle. So you have these. I mean, a lot of these kids are having kids and their kids early 20s, teens, mid 20s, and they're getting locked up, innocent or guilty. But it's a cycle. Now you're having kids growing up without fathers, and they're stuck in this cycle of this exact same activity, and there's just no stoppage.
I mean, you're absolutely right, and it's almost like it's like tragic. And what makes it even more disappointing is that we're living in a period where crime is at an all-time low, but prosecuting people is like at an all-time high. So there's not even any benefit to what we have accomplished as a society in most cities, not just Los Angeles. Los Angeles homicides are down, but most large cities homicides are down all across America. And we're prosecuting people like it's the Wild Wild West. And it's really not. I mean, L.A., the chances of getting shot and killed and hurt in L.A. is so low. But of course, the media is going to show you that one person that happens to, mm-hmm. Every week. And it adds a level of fear. And I think these prosecutors are also influenced by that fear. They're watching the same news.
100%.
I read a report by U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein, who's the senator for California, and it was about gangs. And I read this report, and I swear it was like 50% of the report was all lies. And I don't know if Dianne Feinstein was just getting bad information or if she's really believing this stuff, because I don't know if the senators write these reports. Right. But it's an influential document because it's signed off by a U.S. senator. Right. And it was all lies,
No, you hit on a super important point. Like our legislators, the people who are writing these laws, are directly influenced by bad information. Super bad information. That's why the work you're doing is so important. How do you advise somebody out there who's looking for useful data, correct data in some of these instances? Where do you find some of these sources?
The best place to look for accurate information about street gangs are your sociology and anthropology and geography researchers all across America. And unfortunately, their research is very rarely used when it comes to public policy or legislation. I remember
what information is being used then? Is it the police?
Yeah,
or the FBI?
It's mostly law enforcement arrest reports. I remember when Governor Schwarzenegger was in office, he wanted to learn about gangs and do something on gangs, and I thought it was amazing that he reached out to me. He reached out to another one of my two more of my colleagues, and flew us up to Sacramento to have a discussion on gangs. I think he's probably like the first governor probably ever to do that. But at the end of the day, nothing amounted to anything. He eventually leaned towards law enforcement's views, and he leaned towards more of a suppressive approach towards gangs, and didn't adhere or find useful any of the social science research, which as social scientists, we don't go in there with preconceived ideas.
Right.
We go out there and look at what's happening and then report the facts. Law enforcement already will have a whole set of things to expect and then go out there and try to find those things. And that's why I think using police science or law enforcement data is very it's just not useful, especially if it's going to influence law and public policy.
And don't they jade some of the data anyway? Like there wasn't like with police brutality and stuff, like that stuff is jaded. Like you have to have an independent research.
Well, some of the data in Los Angeles on crimes was actually Chief Charlie Beck got caught either reporting wrong data, collecting it, misleading data. I forget the specifics of it, but you bring up a great point that they're the collectors of this data, and we can't even trust the methodologies in which they collect it because they're getting caught, fudging the numbers, so to speak.
That's like 101, right? So like I have I got a certain amount of income playing in the NFL, right? And when I signed with an agent, initially what they wanted to do was they wanted to have my agent recommended this financial advisor and a business manager, yada yada. And I'm like, no, let's break this up. There has to be checks and balances. So even my financial team now, they audit themselves. They'll have independent. They pay for the IRS to come out. Or they get audited themselves to show that their clientele they're doing a good job with our money, right? So it should be the exact same way with people that are influencing policy. Have somebody else separately that has no incentive to jade the results or have the results go into your favor. Like it has to be independent.
Yeah, we have a system here where we're supposed to trust the government or local law enforcement investigating themselves. And I think there's only maybe 1 or 2 states in the whole country where the state will investigate local, like whenever there's an officer involved shooting, we trust that department that was involved in that shooting to investigate their own shooting.
That's insane.
It is insane. And I think there's only 1 or 2 states where the state now comes in. Like if LAPD is involved in an officer-involved shooting, I believe that California, as a state government, should investigate the shooting that the city was involved in. But we don't do that in America. I think 1 or 2 states do that. We're trusting city government to investigate themselves and to rely on their own conclusion. And I think that's bizarre.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's not. I mean, you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, but like it's come on. Like have you heard any kind of inklings of that blue code that's kind of law
enforcement doesn't even inform on each other. One time I recorded. I was out in the streets and I actually recorded an officer-involved shooting. I videotaped the LAPD shooting and killing an unarmed man. And I immediately wanted the world to see this clip. And my father told me, don't do that. Don't do that. I said, no, I have to do this. I gotta let the world see what I just saw. So I uploaded it to YouTube in 2008. This is when YouTube was pretty young.
Right.
So I put it up there, and immediately the LAPD was calling me. They wanted to question me. And I feel like I should have waited before I uploaded it to see what their story would be.
Right.
Because they didn't know I recorded it.
Right.
I was there and they didn't realize I documented their whole shooting. So eventually I uploaded it. It became a big lawsuit, and force investigation. It's supposed to be like internal affairs, but they don't call it internal affairs. They came to investigate, and when I first thought, I was like, "Oh wow, they really care. They really want to investigate this." But then, as the investigation went on, I realized that these forced investigation detectives are just friends with the guys that did the killing.
Yeah, man.
And there was no recourse. There were no consequences. In fact, it went to trial, and a trial was split. The jury was split on guilt or innocence, and in civil court you only need 9 jurors. You don't need all. It doesn't have to be unanimous in civil court. So the judge told him to go back, and eventually it went 9 jurors thought the cops were right, and 3 thought they were wrong. That was the final thing. But it taught me something about internal affairs, and I don't think internal affairs really isn't internal affairs. Every once in a while, when cops go to jail the most, It's when the feds investigate them. Right now, Lee Baca, who was the top cop of the LA County Sheriff, Paul Tanaka, who was his second in command, they're both in prison. Not because of any internal investigation of their own. It's because the feds came in and investigated it.
Wow.
So we have to rely on the feds to come in and investigate local law enforcement because they're not going to do it themselves.
My God. So what do you think the remedy to that situation is? Because you have, like I said, you have opposite ends of the spectrum, right? So you have people who distrust the police because of years of neglect or over policing, and then you have a side who overly trust the police because they've never had any reason to not trust them. And so you have this divide in this country right now, like back the blue, or of course the NFL players kneeling, which I was one of them. What do you think the remedy of that situation is?
Man, what you just basically described is a racial divide.
Yeah.
And I don't know if whenever stories of law enforcement are told publicly, it's mostly about their heroic, especially coming from the president and coming from Washington, D.C. It's like if you criticize law enforcement, you're a bad person.
Or you're against it.
Yeah, or you're against law enforcement. I think we can support law enforcement as something that we need, but at the same time criticize the corrupt officers that get hired and that become part of the department. There's so much sweeping under the rug. Oh, we can't let this get out because of lawsuits and the liability that cities will face if they let all of the cats out the bag. Yeah. But I think they just need to be more transparent. And this is a word, we've been hearing this transparent. This is like a buzzword now in politics and law enforcement. Right. But I don't think we've reached that level of true transparency.
So I heard Chris Rock told this joke. I think he was saying, I'm a butcher it, but he was like when you're talking about law enforcement and you'll hear people say, oh, it's just one bad apple, it's just one bad guy. He's like, but there's certain jobs where you can't be bad at your job. Like you can't be a pilot and be like, it's one bad pilot. Like, oh, the plane going down, man. But
that was funny actually.
Yeah, he's brilliant. How can you? And I don't think you can. And this is the real big problem in America today, I think, is how can you separate race and politics right now? I don't think you can, because the foundation of this country was based on race and racism and laws, and they're still trickling down and affecting our daily lives. So in your view, can you separate race and politics?
It is very difficult, but I think we will see things change for the better for people of color when America is not majority white anymore.
Oh man,
it's majority. It's gonna be.
I'm gonna hire you security, bro.
It's gonna be majority white for at least the next 30 or 40 years. Mm-hmm. But there is actually a huge effort to prevent it from becoming majority white, and this administration is doing it. And it's back to the MS-13 gang. Mm-hmm. When you hear the president talking about MS-13, he's not really talking about gangs. He's using that as a cover to talk about immigration. Because if we continue immigration into America, we're going to dilute that white population sooner than they want it to be diluted. Mm. So what they're trying to do is slow down immigration into the United States. They know that it's going to be a while before it becomes minority white if you could prevent the Latinos from coming in. But when the whites are the minority, we're going to start to see some real change. But how many years is that? We're, let's say, 2020, 2030, 2040, 2050, we're going to start seeing some big shifts.
That's a deep point that you hit on. And I think, like, when you have 200 white dudes with tiki torches running around and said, they will not replace us, that shit rang heavy to me, because I'm like, what are they talking about, right? And then you dig deeper. White supremacy is a thing in this country that the majority right-wing politicians or politically infused people don't want to admit that white supremacy is a thing in this country, and it's exactly what you're talking about right there. So when you look at the deaths the deaths caused by MS-13 in America, it's the smallest of fraction compared to school shooting.
It's minuscule.
Yeah, it's super small.
There are more black gangs doing violence in LA than MS-13.
Right.
So that's when you know that there's an agenda behind this anti-MS-13 rhetoric, because it's all about immigration.
Right.
And that immigration is going to dilute the white population in America, and that's why Trump is all over it. And
see, this and these kind of subtle agenda-filled tactics that he's been spewing, it's smothered with racism, but it's done in a way where they can still defend their point with saying he's not racist.
I think it's done in a way where some people might see it subtle. I mean, to me, it's obvious, right? Because my lens, I'm wearing different lenses.
Right.
But I can understand where someone might think it's subtle because the words aren't so, overt. It's all about MS-13 as animals. When I hear MS-13 as animals, what I hear is you don't want Mexicans and Central Americans coming to the United States. That's what I hear.
And they'll say legally, and I'm like, it's so obvious to these people, man. And the funny thing is, I'm not a religious man at all. I'm not even aware of your religious beliefs. But when you look at the teachings of, I'm a fan of Jesus, right? Or the teachings of the man that they say he was, when you look at who he was and what he taught, he said love thy neighbor. He said welcome in a stranger to your home, offer him these things. But when you put that into the slot of immigration, but that's different.
Yeah, I think right wing conservatives that are supposed to be ultra religious completely portray themselves opposite of what Jesus would want them to be.
100%. He would be a poor man living in a hill somewhere, all for poor people and immigration.
And politically, I think Jesus would be a socialist and a communist, communal.
Dog, I have this saying. I was like, yo, conservatives, they hate communism. They're all about capitalism. And I'm like, but when they die, they want to live in a communist state. It's the funniest thing ever. It's the biggest contradiction in the world. The thing that they pray to every Sunday, they turn around and they preach against in their day-to-day lives.
And I think that's why people such as yourself have been so jaded by religion, because we have seen religion through the lenses of right-wing conservatives. And I think there are other ways to. I think an accurate portrayal of Jesus's message you might embrace that more so, but you've probably been seeing white Jesus paintings your whole life, hearing all these white right-wing conservatives preaching a message that's oppositional to what Jesus and the scriptures are. So you're like, man, forget this stuff.
Right. It's part of it. I think my journey was more so. Because I was actually raised Muslim, right? So my journey was more so about do I care or do I not care what truth is and what is true and what is not true? And so I went down that rabbit hole of what is true and what is not true. And I was a philosophy major, so I dove into the historicity of Jesus and the religion, and I went through all that things. But I don't want to go down that rabbit hole. But I think that when you look at because you're never going to get rid of a religion, and this is kind of a new epiphany for me, because I used to hate religion not hate religion, but I used to have this strong disdain for it as far as I don't think we need it as a whole. I don't believe that anymore. I think religion is needed because some people need a certain foundation, a moral foundation. Some people can transcend that with thought-provoking ideas, but we're never going to get rid of religious ideologies, especially in America. So I think the goal is to be as diplomatic as possible, but it's so hard when the majority religion that is being preached, because I read the Bible, I've read the Quran, and I listen to the people who are pushing these agendas, these political agendas, and they're not following their own religion. The doctrine, it says it in your doctrine, and you're not an upstanding individual according to your creator. So it's hard for me to take you seriously politically.
Absolutely, and I think our justice system and the way gangs are treated, a lot of the rules and the laws and the enforcement are coming from quote unquote religious right, which would if Jesus was dealing with gang members, he would say, we have to go into their neighborhoods. We got to go into their communities, preach to them one-on-one, and help them on a one-on-one basis, help them in a group basis, dialogue with them, get to understand their personal experience, and help them. And who talks like that from the right religious side? Exactly.
Who was it? I think, was it Buddha? Buddha said, or was it Gandhi? I think it was Gandhi. Gandhi said, we was talking about Christians in America. He said, I like your Jesus, but I don't like your Christians, or something like that. It's a beautiful sentiment that I wish more people would follow. But man, you've been more than gracious with your time, bro. I appreciate you coming down here. It's heavy traffic on Friday, man.
I wasn't too far, man. I appreciate you having me.
No, for sure, man. I think that the work that you have done and you continue to do is beyond honorable. You should have a statue somewhere.
I appreciate that.
For sure, man.
Some people actually hate on me, believe it or not.
Oh, of course. I mean, I can only imagine.
They think I'm glorifying gangs,
right,
or that I'm celebrating it, or I want it to continue, and I'm like, how did that? I mean, am I portraying that?
No. So initially, when I started following the YouTube channel, and I was like, why would you? I mean, I was interested in stuff, but I was like, why would you sit here and interview these cats like this, right? But then I started listening to the questions that you're asking, and then I started really understanding I'm listening to these kids, and I'm like, yo, he's reaching some of these kids, and I was like, who is this cat? Started digging into the cat. I was like, yo, he's done so much work in correcting. The fact that you got 4 people out of prison that were in prison that were guilty is enough, right? Just that on its own, but the fact that you continue to educate and you continue to try to reverse this cyclical symptoms that we have been plagued with, it's honorable, dog. Like, I don't know how else to express to you, but I'm thankful of the work that you've done, for sure, man.
Well, I'm thankful when people can appreciate the angle that I'm coming from. I'm just basically trying to humanize these guys, and I do ask specific questions about their history, their lives, their families. And a lot of gang members are surprised that I ask the questions that I do, because they're expecting like Tom Brokaw type questions.
Yeah.
You know, how many guns do you have on you right now?
Right.
How much dope did you sell this week? You know,
right,
and that's not the angle I'm coming from.
100%. And I think your work will stand the test of time. Like, nobody that has ever done anything important has been embraced from day one.
I appreciate that immensely.
No, for sure, man. So I don't know if you're a fan of the podcast, but at the end of every podcast, man, we end it the exact same way. One of my favorite people in the world is Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey is an amazing character to me. Like, aside from the work that he's done in acting and how much he's made us laugh, I think he has a brilliant mind. And so I ask every one of my guests to try to lobby for me to get him on my podcast, man. So if you could look we're going to create a video montage of everybody trying to lobby for me. So you look in the camera and talk to Jim for me, man.
And everyone has actually done this for you.
Every single one, from Snoop Dogg to who, you know, NASA astronaut, everybody's done it.
Reggie Bush,
my mother, everybody.
Your mother was the first guest, huh?
Yeah, she was the first guest.
I was surprised how much cursing you were doing in front of your mom.
we went through a lot, man. So that's the least. You know?
I can't curse in front of my mom.
I hear you, man. We come from a different generation, man. My mom is one of my best friends, man.
All right, Jim Carrey. I first saw you in 1990 or 89 and In Living Color. I thought you was the funniest dude on In Living Color. I believe that the Wayans gave you your start, and I would love for you to come on Arian's show and tell us that history. How did you start off? Were the Wayans your big shot? And what was it like being a white guy on an all-black comedy show? So come on this podcast and tell that story, because I want to know.
For sure, man. For sure. We appreciate that, man. We're gonna put it together soon, man. We got a lot of footage of people saying that, man. But my dog, I appreciate you, man. If anybody wants to find, I don't know if you want to be found on the internet at all.
They know where I'm at.
They know where you're at, man.
Streetgangs.com.
Streetgangs.com. Look at the research. Look at the film. The films. You want to plug anything, man?
Just go to streetgangs.com. Watch the videos. Comment, share, like, hate, whatever you want to do. Right?
For sure, man. Well, we appreciate you, man. I thank you for coming on so much, man.
Thanks again.
Much love, brother.